makes me blush. And thank you for coming out on such a wintry and snowy night. I appreciate your presence. And let me also thank Cindy Fair, who made the coordination of my trip here such a breeze. I'm honored to be here, and I'm very excited to share some of my work with you folks. And I look forward to our discussion afterwards. Let me bracket one thing. So one of the images that I will be using in the presentation apparently generated a little bit of a, what shall we say, resistance, because people thought that I was equating contemporary Iran with ISIS. I will get to that, and that's a very interesting point, not to refute, not to correct, but actually to have a conversation about, particularly around revolutionary Islamic aesthetics that we can hopefully get into during the Q&A after you saw the other images that the same artist has produced. Okay, so without further ado, let me get started. On January 25th, 2012, a brigade associated with the Free Syrian Army stopped an Iranian pilgrimage bus in Hama and abducted 22 male pilgrims. The kidnapping sent a warning to the Iranian state not to collaborate with the Assad regime. Less than 2 weeks later, the Iranian government issued a ban on all road travel to Syria. 5 months later, Free Syrian Army fighters abducted all 48 passengers of another bus carrying pilgrims, this time from the Damascus airport, so the Iranians flew, right, to the Sayyida Zainab shrine. And this is what our shrine looks like. The bus carried 5 Iranian Revolutionary Guards, including snipers that the brigade alleged worked in Hama. Elsewhere too, pilgrim abductions continued. The Islamic Front Brigade, Asafat al-Shamal, or the Northern Storm, kidnapped 11 Shia Lebanese pilgrims en route on reverse to Iran at the Reyhanli border crossing with Turkey. In retaliation, a group named Zuwar Imam al-Rida, or visitors of Imam Reza, captured 2 Turkish Airlines personnel to force a diplomatic negotiation. As with the Revolutionary Guards, the deal that set the captives free was brokered by the Qatari diplomats. In the deal, the Syrian state was forced to release over 60 jailed women that the brigade demanded. Yet subsequent bombings of the Sayyida Zainab shrine served as the pretext for Hezbollah to move into Syrian territory in the name of protecting the shrine against further aggression. This move further ushered another episode in the Syrian crisis, often glossed over in scholarly as well as popular accounts as the Balkanization or sectarianization of the Syrian conflict. We have heard these stories over and over again before. The imbrication of militant brigades, pilgrims, Revolutionary Guards with the states of Lebanon, Syria, Turkey, Qatar, and Iran is often presented as a horror story of transnational chaos in the Middle East. Terrorism and security experts explain away such traffic in state and non-state actors using the catch-all category of sectarianism. Confident declarations about a seamless history of sectarian difference dating back millennia are offered as the internal logic of the region working itself out. It isn't just journalists or political experts who resort to such discourse. In scholarly debates as well, one increasingly comes across sectarianism as an explanatory paradigm for understanding the Levant and Mashriq in particular, but also the broader Middle East in general. This paradigm operates on 3 assumptions. First, that people in the Islamic world and the Middle East conceive of religious difference and identity through ahistorical and static categories of sect, madhab, right? And recursive interfaith violence. In the schema, Islam is much more than religion. It's an overriding cosmology that structures every part of life for Muslims. Second, in this cosmology, rituals such as ziyarat or saint visitation is assumed to be reiterative rather than generative of confessional or doctrinal difference. It's merely a practice that reproduces a stable, originary, scripturally mandated structure of this difference between Sunnis and the Shia. Third, transnational mobility, sensationalized through the movements of armed and militant groups and revolutionary guards, renders traveling while Muslim itself suspect. Because Muslims are assumed to be docile subjects of sectarian faith, their mobility becomes synonymous with the cross-border export of ideology and violence. My talk today aims to dispense with these assumptions and offer an alternative way to approach ritual and doctrinal difference through a study of Iranian ziyarat, or visitation to Syria via Turkey. Shifting our analytical focus towards the formation of the root itself, I argue that the making of doctrinal subjects and meanings has to be understood in relation to the making of states and economies in the region. This does not mean pilgrims are mere byproducts of regional political economy. Rather, I hope to show you that the practices and meanings of pilgrimage are shaped by, but not determined by, wider processes of spatial production. Moreover, attending to the micro-practices of pilgrims themselves eliminates the impossibility of neatly separating the religious from other forms of meaning in social life. Let us now turn to the route. Well before its implication in the trans-regional war currently fought in Syria, Sayyida Zainab's shrine gained importance as a site of veneration among Iranians shortly after the revolution. Sayyida Zainab, or Hazrat Zainab Kubra, is the elder daughter of Imam Ali and the sister of Imam Hussein, who would be decapitated by the forces of Yazid I, the second Umayyad Caliph in the war of Karbala in current-day Iraq. After his death in London, Dr. Ali Shariati, for some, the most prominent ideologue of the revolution, before it gets hijacked, again, according to some, was buried in the cemetery adjacent to the shrine. We'll come back to him later. The number of Iranian pilgrims rose steadily from the 10,000s in the mid-1980s to more than 250,000 annually by the year 2010. And you can also add about 150,000 Pakistanis to this number, and you get about 1 million people altogether per year visiting this particular shrine. This traffic in Iranian pilgrims could add up to 40 buses a day on this route itself, particularly around Nowruz, Persian New Year. The pilgrims from Tabriz with whom I traveled in 2010 covered about 800 miles through Iran, Turkey, and Syria to reach the shrine, approximately the distance between Chicago and New York. During the journey to Damascus, or on their way back, pilgrims' visitations within Turkey also included 3 stops. Veysel Qarani's tomb nearby Khan Siirt, that allegedly contains a piece of Prophet Muhammad's cardigan. Balıklı Göl, or an ancient madrasa associated with the story of Abraham and Nimrod in Urfa, and the Iranian bazaar in Antep. Today, I examine this route as a key site for articulating contemporary Islamic practice. And first, I trace how previous histories and routes of mobility informed the emergence of Sayyida Zainab's ziyarat, or it's commonly known in Persian, Hajj-Fuqara, or pilgrimage of the poor or humble. On the basis of this analysis, I then offer a processual view of contemporary Islamic practice, which allows us to see the dynamic interplay of religious authority, economic opportunity, and political possibility. Thinking of Islamic religious practice in these more historical and processual terms allows us to reconceptualize ritual itself. In this reconceptualization, ziyarat in particular and ritual in general emerges as a generative sphere of political and socioeconomic negotiation, or what Pierre Bourdieu has called regulated improvisation, rather than the reiteration of a hermetically sealed discursive tradition. Let me give you one example of such improvisation from the Iranian bazaar in Antep. When one approaches this marketplace from the intersections of Turkmenler Avenue, a major street with bustling traffic in Antep, the shops and booths of the bazaar appear as the shiny arches of a passageway to a pilgrim's consumption pit. In June 2009, I met Metin Abi, a 50-year-old merchant in the bazaar. Back then, he owned a profitable little shop selling kitchen appliances, pots and pans, as well as glassware to Iranian pilgrims. On the other side of the sidewalk, Metin Abi had employed a mobile seller, Yavuz, with his cart to work as his apprentice in the bazaar. Yavuz, an 18-year-old recent high school graduate, was to learn Persian and the business inside the store when he wasn't busy with Metin's cart stocked with contraband sugar, tea, and cigarettes like Iranian bahmans that were shuttled by the same buses that carried the Iranian pilgrims. Many Gaziantep locals themselves frequented the bazaar to see the contraband inventory of the week, like this. So what it says in Turkish is that it's guaranteed contraband tea. Yeah, it's guaranteed, it's authentic. As for the Iranian pilgrims, they tended to go after kitchen appliances, pots and pans, as well as Syrian lingerie. These items were particularly popular with women shopping for bridal dowries or for those who wanted to ask the saint, Sayyida Zainab, for an intercession in matters of marital life. Such requests included finding a suitable bachelor, conceiving a baby, or keeping a relationship with problems alive. Those were the three things. And I'm going to get into some of the other things that they asked the saint to intercede on their behalf for, but these were the three dominant kind of themes. Metin's neighbors in the bazaar, Osman and Yashar, had just brokered a wholesale shipment of Syrian lingerie from Souq al-Hamidiyya in Damascus, where it's invented, really, this particular form. Their store featured an already impressive women's undergarment selection from Istanbul, yet making the next big move, they had taken out a hefty bank loan to move their store to the newly constructed Ataturk arcade. The arcade was modeled after the Golestan Mall in Tehran, Tehran's first shopping center ever, and supported by the municipal government in Antep through a mortgage program to formalize the informal bazaar. These transformations in the bazaar made Metin Abi resentful. They reminded him how he had not changed a thing in his business, including the label, which is very much from 1975, for the past 15 years, in stark contrast to Osman and Yashar's business operations in the Ataturk arcade. Pointing to his sugar and tea, Metin Abi protested, and I quote, "Do you know where these come from? From Damascus, on the same buses, the ones that carry your so-called poor pilgrims, Fuqara Hajjilar. They have money for tefal pans, they look for Pasha Bahçe glassware, and they're after Syrian lingerie. Who's the Fuqara? They or we?" After these rhetorical questions, Metin concluded, there are no Hajj-Majj in these buses, pilgrims, right? I don't interfere in anyone's belief, but there's only one Hajj in Islam, and that's to Mecca. Right? And these people are zawar, or visitors. They're tourists of belief, inançtustu. They're undertaking ziyarat, and as they themselves say, it's both ziyarat and trade, hem ziyarat, hem ticaret in Persian. I might benefit from their travels as a merchant, and I'm no imam, but I know that since the time of Abdulhamid II, since Ottoman times, Iranian states supported ziyarat to occupy Iraq. And now they're on to Syria, end of quote. Metin Abi knew all too well that Iranian Zawar, those tourists of belief, in his words, might not necessarily feel the need to compare the value of visitation of Sayyida Zainab against the yardstick of Hajj to Mecca, or that some other Zawar might actually agree with them if such a hierarchy must be asserted. Yet the prevalence of Metin's views among the merchants of the bazaar and the sectarianizing undertones of those views show how this contestation does more than assert Sunni ritual minimalism as an index of sophistication and purity over the Shia. Metin also makes certain claims about the historicity of Iranian ziyarat in relation to interstate territorial rivalry between the Ottomans and, in this case, the Qajars. While he charts a regionally networked geography of visitation, he traces the geography's roots with commodities that move along the pilgrims. The sociality of this route, Metin frames through the mutual imbrication of contraband goods to call into question the religious value of ziyarat. In Metin's setup, religious value emerges out of improvisation in debating the historicity and sociality of ziyarat, it's not reducible to jurisprudential debate or exegetical exercises alone. Instead, both the debate and the improvisation play out quite literally over the commodities that Iranian zawad buy. Before we delve any deeper into the contemporary roots of Zainab and their regulated improvisations, I want us to step back to consider two historical processes that shaped the genealogy of Hajj-Fuqara from Iran to Syria. The first is the interstate and regional regulations of Iranian pilgrims' mobility, and the second is the formation of markets and circulation of goods within that traffic in Iranian pilgrims. I will touch upon the history of each as a constitutive element of the routes and journeys of ziyarat, and then move us to an analysis of how they continue to shape contemporary pilgrimage on the paths of Zainab. What I hope to show you today is that contemporary Islamic practice is a product of improvised regulations at different scales by states and pilgrims alike. And taking its historicity seriously, as Metin already does, although tweaking it for his own purposes, is an important point of departure to do just that. Ziyarat, or pilgrimage to the tombs of holy persons, literally a visit or visiting, has been a widespread practice across the Islamic world dating back to the 9th century. In the Turco-Persian context, it emerged as a bone of contention first in a treaty signed in 1555 between the Ottomans and the Safavids, aimed at delineating the parameters of their attendant imperial sovereignty. In return for Safavid recognition of Ottoman sovereignty over Baghdad, Basra, and Western Kurdistan, Ottomans guaranteed Safavid subjects safe transit over Ottoman lands to the Hijaz for Hajj, and access to Atabad shrines located in contemporary Iraq in Karbala, Najaf, Qazama, and Samarra. The roots of pilgrimage were thus intimately linked to regional state formation and the exercise of imperial sovereignty. Theological debates over the permissibility and religious virtues of ziyarat intensified with the Safavid formalization and theological endorsement of Atabad visitation as akin in value to Hajj. But the Iranian genealogy of ziyarat does not involve episodes of sectarian violence such as the Wahhabi sacking of Karbala in 1802 and the production of intra-Islamic difference. It also features declarations of unity in the face of doctrinal differences. One such example is Nader Shah, who during his coronation at Mughal in 1736 criticized the widespread ritual condemnation of the first three caliphs, known as Sabbu Raft, as an underclass practice that stained the soil of Iran. Nader Shah further attempted to bridge the widening doctrinal divide between the Sunni and the Shia by proposing to the Ottomans, holders of the caliphate at the time, to accept Iranian Shiism as a fifth madhab, or madhab Jafari. The Ottoman state's political suspicions of Iranians on the move in Anatolia and the Mashriq outlived the Safavids. The Sublime Porte archives feature many Iranian complaints about the ill treatment of pilgrims on their way to Hijaz and Iraq, as well as Ottoman objections to Iranian rituals of caliph condemnation well into the 19th century. As Selim Deringil shows, even late 19th century Ottoman administrations took measures to restrict the movements of Iranian Zuwad and shorten the time they spend in the Atabad shrines in Iraq. We see in these dynamics that doctrinal difference was intimately tied to political contestation. The shifting landscape of pilgrimage then has to be understood in relation to shifting landscapes of state sovereignty. Moreover, jurisprudential debates over ziyarat were most lively and polarized at times of political upheaval. And this is what I mean by confusing cause and effect in studies of sectarianism, right? Politics come first, then comes the theological debating. We see this, for instance, in the battles between Anatolia and Persia over the Qazilbash in the 18th century, and the mass conversions of Sunni Arab tribes to Shi'ism in the 18th and 19th in Hamidian Iraq, what Metin was creatively repurposing for his own argument. It was, however, not only overt political contestation that transformed the routes of ziyarat. The concurrent flows of commerce and trade along the route remained a persistent theme in interstate negotiations in the Middle East. A disagreement over the interpretation of a clause from the 1847 Erzurum Treaty, is a case in point. Iranian representatives understood the treaty as guaranteeing tax-free cross-border movement of non-commercial goods by pilgrims. They claimed that in violation, Ottoman customs officials were taxing pilgrims' carpets, rugs, and woven prayer mats as commercial goods, even though they were in fact for personal use. Flatly rejecting such accusations of ill treatment, Ottoman border authorities asserted in retaliation that merchants pretending to be pilgrims, zuvar kılığında, crossed the Ottoman-Iran border to smuggle in cloaks, turquoise stone, so aba, firuze, and saffron to be sold in Karbala and Najaf bazaars. They reiterated that it was these commercial goods alone that were being taxed according to Ottoman customs regulations. And I talked about the implications of pilgrimage and contraband a little bit earlier today, so we can talk about that in the Q&A if you so wish. The collapse of the Ottoman Empire, now I'm gonna jump a little bit, and the designation of Iraq as a British mandate were to ease the trans-imperial restrictions placed on the movements of Iranian pilgrims regionally. Nevertheless, the internal reform and secularization efforts under Reza Shah curtailed the movements of Iranian pilgrims and imposed strict quotas of visitation of the Atabad shrines in Iraq for decades to come. Reza Shah and his son and successor, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, considered ziyarat to be a backward and superstitious practice and remained deeply suspicious of religious proceedings in general. Mohammad Reza, the son, were to undertake ziyarat al-Qom in 1950 and to Mashhad in 1953 in an attempt to reclaim his religious legitimacy. He saw what was happening and what was coming his way. Several events and processes through the 1980s turned the visitation of Zainab into one of the very few safe ziyarat routes to take outside of Iran. First, the sites of Karbala and Najaf remained inaccessible for prolonged periods of time during the Iran-Iraq War. Second, Bunyad Shahid, or Martyrs Foundation in Iran, initiated a voucher program for the widows of war to embark on Sayyida Zainab's shrine during the Iran-Iraq War. Third, Saudi Arabia imposed quotas particularly held low for Iranians going to Hajj after the 1987 events in Mecca, which left 275 Iranian pilgrims dead. These events dramatically shifted the possibilities of pilgrimage for Iranians and further curtailed their mobility, already under extreme stress due to newly imposed visa regulations on Iranian nationals after the revolution. The same geopolitical events also transformed the subjects of veneration and their hierarchies of value. Call the geography department, we're there. The figure of Zainab is a case in point. With post-revolutionary Iran, Zainab emerged as the mythical ideal type for revolutionary womanhood. This centrality lent further legitimacy to the veneration of Sayyida Zainab. So this image comes from the first women's magazine of Iran, Etelat Banuvan, which was shut down in 1979 with the revolution, and then relaunched in 1981 under the editorship of Zahra Rahnavad, with the name Rah Zainab, the way of Zainab. And the text right here is a translation from Arabic into Persian, retelling the story of what Zainab had done in terms of speaking truth to power after the Karbala War. Murals, posters, and other artworks featuring Zainab, such as the works of Nasar Palangi, speaks to how pervasive she became as a political emblem in Iranian cultural life, particularly during the war. Even within the Iranian national narrative, Zainab experienced changes. From the emblem of revolutionary womanhood, Zainab was gradually domesticated as the ideal type caretaker. So her birthday today is celebrated officially in Iran as the Nurses' Day, right? But the elevation of Zainab as a national symbol was not just a tightly controlled state exercise. Nationally, and before the advent of Iranian ziyarat to Syria, as Min Mu'allim shows, the deliberate choice to highlight Zainab over Fatima produced unintended consequences. So the way they're normally compared, particularly also in writings of Shariati, is that Fatima symbolizes persistence against pain, right? And Zainab is the complete opposite. She speaks truth to power, right? She's kind of the wild, undomesticated woman figure in this kind of hagiography. So what did this deliberate choice to highlight Zainab over Fatima do? It allowed particularly young women to claim public space and vocalize their dissent against the Pahlavi regime without family interventions, opening up some space, some relative space, of political and social maneuver. The ziyarat undertaken to venerate Zainab has also had similarly unintended consequences. Well beyond the statist ritual of welfare projected in Bonyera Shahid voucher programs for widows of war, Hajj-Fuqara, in the hands of Iranian pilgrims, has turned into a transnational escapade for Iranians, otherwise confined by selective issuing of passports inside the country and that of visas outside, right? As alternative routes of religious mobility proliferated both within and outside of Iran, buses filled with Iranian pilgrims continued to traverse the borders between Iran, Turkey, and Syria, adding an important destination to a regionally networked geography of visitation. Here's a poster from the archives of the University of Chicago that shows you the different shrines, essentially, that have become very popular as sites of visitation in the 80s. Meanwhile, in the post-2003 Iraq, self-proclaimed Salafi and other Sunni revivalist militant groups, citing the Wahhabi sackings of 1802, continued to target both the shrines themselves, such as those in Samarra and Karbala, and the buses shuttling pilgrims to them from Iran. The doctrinal pretext for these attacks was that seeking saintly intercession in worldly matters, shafa, in particular, and ziyara itself should be condemned as bid'ah, a non-canonical and heretical innovation in Islam. These attacks rippled through Iran, shaping the relationship between the various routes and destinations in this broader geography of visitation. The attacks on Atabat shrines in Samarra and Karbala, in other words, helped reroute Iranian pilgrims onto the ways of Zainab to Syria. And as Hajj-Fuqara rose in popularity for pilgrims, states followed suit by having constituted a visa-free zone through which Iranian Zawar could freely, if precariously, move. So Iranians don't require to get into Turkey, and they don't require a visa to get into Syria, right? So that's a very rare, physically or geographically congruous corridor of mobility for Iranians. As with political regulations and deregulations of borders, the economy of pilgrimage has not been just about state priorities or diplomatic arbitrage. The commercial networks and trade connections that became so central to ziyarat also came out of the practices of Iranian pilgrims themselves. By traveling to new sites of veneration and forging new commercial ties along the route, Iranian pilgrims have produced not only new spaces of religious practice, but also those of economic transaction. Such interconnected practices are precisely what lend themselves to the description of the route, the Hajj-Fuqara, as a movement of ham ziyarat, ham tijarat, both visitation and commerce or trade. As we will see, however, Iranian pilgrims had their own ways of valuing these overlaps. To recap then, what I've argued thus far is that trans-imperial border regulations and attendant economic circumscription sedimented as the two key mechanisms through which ziyarat found new articulations on the paths of Zainab. It is then at the intersection of political and economic regulations and the pilgrims' improvisations under those regulations that ziyarat should be approached as an emergent form of doctrinal difference. By contrast to the assumed referential relationship between scripture and ritual, where the latter, ritual, necessarily reproduces the authorizing discourse of the former, scripture, pilgrims have utilized ziyarat to lay claims to new routes of movement in the rapidly shifting political landscape of the region. This pattern of veneration and visitation reflects an awareness of their political embeddedness with larger structures of state authority, a recognition of the creative gap between myth and ritual, and a sense of their agency in bridging that gap. In Iranian pilgrims' mobility across Iraq and the Levant, we observe both creatively improvised invocations of Islamic traditions of pilgrimage and visitation, and claims to transnational mobility that belie a sharp distinction between religion and other realms of social life. Let me now take you back to the pilgrims I met between 2009 and 2014 on their way to the Sayyida Zainab shrine. Here I want to suggest it's precisely through the claims they made on this route of mobility, with a variety of means at hand and a variety of ends in mind, that pilgrims produced ziyarat as a field of force, in which different notions of religious authority, economic opportunity, and political possibility battled for discursive and material hegemony. Back at the women's garment store in Atatürk Passage in Antep, Osman and Yashar's dreams to attract many Iranian pilgrims came true as early as 2011. Some of these pilgrims found it more difficult to bargain in Souq al-Hamidiyya in Damascus, and were told by previous travelers that the Iranian bazaar in Antep had the better prices and higher quality for household items for bridal dowries. At the store and elsewhere, I've encountered as many reasons for undertaking the ziyarat as the pilgrims themselves. So let me give you a few examples. Maryam, a 28-year-old teacher from Tabriz, took the trip to ask for Sayyida Zainab's help in conceiving a child, which has been the biggest issue of tension and anxiety in her 2-year-old marriage. For Feride, a 32-year-old textile worker from Tehran, the journey was actually her second. She wanted to give the saint her thanks for having efficaciously interceded on her search for an appropriate suitor by sacrificing a sheep in the shrine town and donated to a local Shia seminary, or Husseyniyat. While in Damascus, Farida also wanted to visit the Sayyida Ruqayya mosque, mentioned as efficacious for those who want to conceive a baby. And Sayyida Ruqayya is Hazrat Zainab's sister, the little sister, and Imam Ali's youngest daughter, who died at the age of 4. And her last stop was Souq al-Hamidiyya, renowned for its textiles and Syrian lingerie that she wanted to visit. In Osman and Yashar's women's undergarment shop, the conversation ranged from the presumed aura of the lingerie models and the slippages between pilgrimage and tourism. A Tehrani woman in her late 30s and a film editor by profession, Mona, had embarked on the journey with her family, primarily because, as she put it, she liked traveling. Over a cup of guaranteed contraband tea in the store, Mona and I had discussed what she thought of the description of the route as ham ziyarat, ham tijarat. When the conversation steered in the direction of religious virtues of the route that is so enmeshed in trade and commodity exchange, Osman reiterated a more carefully worded version of Metin Abi's differentiation between Hajj and ziyarat, to suggest that ziyarat is less than Hajj, right? In response to their attempt to brush aside ziyarat's religious values because women buy things en route, Mona replied, and I quote in full, "I find the commentary itself politically motivated. I mean, I'm not even religious, but I am Iranian and we are used to seeing things political told in religious terms. What does the Saudis building clock towers and the hotels around the Kaaba do to Hajj then? I think that's the more interesting question. Why do you want my belief, iman, to account for lingerie? Does Christianity account for women's use of undergarments? Or men's use of underwear for that matter? You buy your zamzam and prayer beads, another one buys pants and lingerie, because that's what's good on that route. And the majority of the travelers are women. To me, if there are bazaars around ziyarat, it means ziyarat is alive and well. It means Antep merchants are alive and well, and everyone makes what they want to make of ziyarat." End of quote. Like Maryam, Farida, and Mona, many pilgrim women have made Syrian lingerie, along with glassware and kitchen appliances, one of the most sought after commodities in Antep's Iranian bazaar. For them, there was no ethical dilemma between why they set out for saintly intercession and veneration of Zainab on the one hand, and buying kitchen appliances, pans, and lingerie on the other. In fact, once pressed to elaborate, some pilgrims such as Farida would say there was an incongruence. This is her logic. If what compelled them to go on the ziyarat route, at least in part, was seeking intercession to achieve marital happiness and sexual satisfaction, summoning other material means through which one could work toward that goal, say Syrian lingerie on special nights such as the wedding night or an anniversary, was no-brainer. This assemblage and its various mobilizations, ranging from Metin's comments to Mona's refusal of the very terms of that comment, illustrate how concepts of womanhood and gender remain a major discursive fold for articulating both Islamic identity and its doctrinal differences. Mona's choices of substitution are also telling, Zamzam for lingerie. Through them, she takes the politically overdetermined conjuncture in the region, as opposed to the doctrinally predetermined differences between the Sunni and the Shia, as what shapes the evaluation of religious virtue associated with ziyarat. Mona highlights how pilgrims, too, not unlike the merchants of the bazaar, undertake a variety of personal, social, and political action on the route. Such multidimensionality itself, Mona asserts, makes the route not less, but more alive and popular, hence all the more virtuous. As the numbers of pilgrims on Zainab's paths increased, so did stories of efficaciousness attributed to Zainab's and Ruqayya's barakah in saintly intercession. And as Mona so aptly put, some bought glassware, kitchen appliances, and others yet Syrian lingerie. This was not something to be puzzled over. Instead, Mona showed how to do things with pilgrimage, to put in terms of Austin's speech theory. The messy social life of ziyarat and its compelling possibilities to bring ritualistic action to bear on the immediate material needs and desires was precisely what attracted so many Iranians onto the paths of Zainab. When Mona and I met again in 2014 in her living room in Tehran's upscale Saadabad neighborhood, that is to say, she wasn't all that fuqara in Metin's sense of the poor, she explained more what she had meant by being Iranian en route to Zainab. She recounted her aunt Nur Khanum's encounters with two guards in the shrine itself. The guards prevented Mona's aunt from praying within a zone for temporary and shorter supplications of prayers, dua, and not for namaz or salah. They redirected Nur Khanum to a separate prayer room adjacent to the zone that hosted the mausoleum of Hazrat Zainab. Mona's aunt resisted and, joined by a few more women, carried on with her namaz within the shrine. In response, the guards reiterated in broken Persian that there were Shia too, and that she was not the first Ajam to enter the maqam, and they asked her to move on. She repeated that pilgrims were allowed to recite supplications around the tomb, but the traffic in the mausoleum had to continue in order to prevent overcrowding and stampedes. Nur Khanum, stunned by the guard's comments, reiterated that a Shia should never stop another Shia from praying anywhere. The guard's insistence made matters only worse with Mona's aunt and her supporters. In protest, they decided to hold their namaz next to the burial place of Dr. Ali Shariati. And I quote, "From the grounds of Karbala to those of Samarra, to Sayyida Zainab and Sayyida Ruqayya, it makes no difference," Mona told me. "The fear of the righteous Iranians is what we encounter. There are Sunnis, Shias, and Christians coming to visit, but they ban our practice of namaz in the presence of Zainab. That's unjust. We Iranians, we are fuqara harakat, so we're poor of mobility." Nur Khanum's and other Iranian women's refusal to go to the designated namaz khuneh and instead proceed with their prayers in front of Shariati's burial place marked a particularly powerful protest, indexing a revolutionary interpretation of Islam characteristically associated with Shariati. But it also invokes another, again, notion of historicity, right, that is very much alive in the sociality of ritual. Nur Khanum's encounter with the Syrian guards at the shrine also show how the minute spatial regulations of ritual were contested not only across the Sunni-Shia divide, they were contested within Shia communities themselves, divided along national lines and their attendant cultural histories. Although very small, Syria, besides Alawites, has about 2% of Jafari Shia, right? These dynamics which unfolded between Mona's aunt and the Syrian guards have been in the making for over 3 decades. For Iranian pilgrims, women in particular, the embrace of Zainab's route allowed access to a regional geography of movement in an Iran struck by what they called a poverty of mobility. It, in effect, respatialized the viable route of ziyarat, bringing a previously negligible shrine in terms of pilgrimage numbers to the status of a revered site of veneration. While the pilgrims' reasons for summoning saintly intercession varied and the movement continued to transform an already long history of ziyarat in the region, so did their ritual acts with the aim of offering supplications, venerating the saint, and bidding her to intercede in worldly matters. In this talk, I've argued that the pilgrimage of those who suffer from a poverty of mobility exemplifies the historicity and sociality of contemporary Islamic practice. By engaging with historical as well as social contestation over their access to Sayyida Zainab's shrine in Syria, and in the process remaking routes of mobility, markets, and commerce, as well as the meaning of Shiism, Iranian pilgrims have in effect remade the regions in which they are traveling. In other words, I want to suggest that Iranian pilgrims' regulated improvisations of ziyarat helped form the region anew, what some fear as the Shia crescent, right? Yet, how does this account of Iranian ziyarat give us new purchase on the anthropological and historical study of contemporary Islam? Okay, I need a second here. Over the past 2 decades, Islamic revivalism has become an important object of interdisciplinary analysis. In anthropology and Middle East studies alike, a new anthropology of Islamic revival called into question earlier modernist accounts that projected the secularization of non-Western societies and constructed an Islamic exception to that teleology. Against the older modernist binary between secular politics and traditional Islam, this new scholarship, most notably associated with Tel al-Asad, sought to make sense of the practices of revivalist Muslims from within the network of concepts on which they themselves have drawn. This direction of inquiry focused on power, disciplinary practice, and ethical cultivation reiterated through authorizing discourses. In so doing, however, it has also shifted attention away from social parts of Islamic practice, such as ritual and pilgrimage, deemed now as the archaic object of analysis exhausted by symbolic anthropology. So I'm thinking of Victor Turner here. By contrast to a focus on ritual, the chosen objects of analysis in these new anthropologies of Islam have become the more individualized as well as more scholastic forms of Islamic piety, such as daily prayers, namaz or salat, Quran